All right, hi everybody. Welcome for this is session 7 of our series on how to pray for government. Today we're going to look at authority and submission. And I want you to just keep in mind that don't think of this one as a standalone session. This one is going to tie very closely with our session on resistance and rebellion. And um, this is, we're going to look at a principle that is true throughout Scripture, acknowledging that there are caveats, there are exceptions to this rule, which we will unpack in that rebellion and resistance session. So keep these in mind. These are true. These are good. It's a rule, which means 95, 98% of the time this is how we walk. And so it's important to keep this in mind because I think a lot of times in the church we see people clamoring for that exception to get to walk in resistance or rebellion. But this is the rule. This is kind of the pattern that's set for us in Scripture. So let's start right from the beginning. In Genesis 1, God kind of sets a pattern for how we are to walk in authority. And where that comes down is in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, there's this statement of why and how he created man. And he says in verse 26, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And right there, you have a glimpse into the Trinity. You have one God in three persons consulting together. Let us make man in our image and let them have dominion. Okay, so there's this idea of authority over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, livestock of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. In verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and so on. And so right in the beginning in chapter 1 of Genesis, God's creating man, and one of the purposes he created us for was to have authority, to partner with him in expressing his rule and reign on the earth. And there's other purposes with that. He created us to know him, make man in our image, and the idea there so that he could walk with us and know us. Um, Character to reflect his nature, being made in his likeness. And this idea of authority, expressing his authority on the earth, is an expression of function. He created us with a purpose, a function on this earth, and that's a big part of it, to walk in his authority. And fourth, to reproduce, to multiply, and the idea to impart life to others. And so all of these purposes, here's the reason I mentioned those four, all of them flow out of the first one, which is relationship. We only do the character thing well. We only express godly character when we're walking in right relationship with him. When we're, 2 Corinthians 3, when we gaze on him, we behold him, we become like him. And so that happens there. The reproducing, we only really impart life to others as we are being filled, as we're receiving life ourselves. But this function thing is a big one. We only walk in his authority as we walk in right relationship with him. And we see that in Adam and Eve. As they walked in right relationship with God, um, the the earth responded well. All the indications are the earth responded well to Adam and Eve. And you get the impression that work wasn't, work was before the curse. Work came before the fall. So it tells me that work was probably more of a pleasure and a delight, in that whatever it is they put their hands to in tending and keeping the garden, there was a healthy response. It worked. It bore fruit. It was productive. But at the fall, when sin came into the picture, when that right relationship with God was broken, work became hard, and we see that in the curse that was spoken to Adam in the aftermath of the fall. The Lord said, "Because you've eaten of the tree that I told you not to eat of, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it'll bring forth for you, and you'll eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread until you return to the ground." So the idea is, with those things being stated, what's implied there is that none of those things were true beforehand. So all these things that make work hard, made it hard for Adam, made it difficult for Adam to to walk in the dominion that he had over the land and how he was tending and keeping it. That all that all went away with this curse. So, we can kind of take the opposite to have been true before the fall. And we see that what made that hard for him was the broken relationship with God. They stepped outside the one boundary God gave them, which damaged the relationship. And as an effect of that, their ability to walk in the full, I guess you could say, power, but the benefits of the authority, and seeing the outworking of that readily on the earth, that was broken as well. And so that's an important thing for us to take from this, is from that, right from Genesis 1. We were designed to be expressions of God's rule and reign on the earth, to walk in his authority, but it only happened for Adam and Eve as they walked in right relationship with God, as they were submitted to God. When they sinned, they ceased submitting to God and said, nope, we're going to do it my way instead. And so we only walk in the authority of God, in the authority God's given us, as we remain submitted to him. Okay? So that's kind of the first example, looking right at the beginning at Adam and Eve. Here's another example in the Word for us from Roman numeral 2. This is from Jesus, our chief example, right? Part of his coming as a man, Paul says, was to succeed where Adam fell short. He was the second Adam. He came to succeed at what Adam failed to do the first time around. And a big part of that is this idea of walking in the authority of God. So when it came to demonstrating the power and authority of God, Jesus consistently did it from a posture of submission, always in relationship with his Father, submitted to his Father. Okay, so I've got one passage listed for you here, a few verses from John 5, where Jesus said, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So the idea there is that I am working, I am partnering with my Father in what he's doing. Verse 20, for the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. Okay, so relationship, the Father loves the Son. I'm in this loving relationship with the Father, and he shows me what he is doing. And then verse 36, the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, this is Jesus talking, right? The works the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. He's saying the works that I'm doing are the works the Father has given me to do. He didn't go about making his own to-do list. He didn't come up with his own ideas of how to demonstrate power, how to teach, he took his cues from the Father. The works he did were the works the Father gave him to do. And I've got a number of other passages there from the book of John that show how Jesus acted in authority in submission to the Father. That's where the source of his authority came from. And Acts 2:22, Peter preaching about him, he said, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him. So even though Jesus was the second person of the Trinity, he was God himself, God in the flesh. The signs and wonders and works that he did were still God working through him. He didn't do it of his own accord or power and authority. It was the Father through the Holy Spirit working through him. So even in the person of Jesus, we see this thing of authority. The authority he walked in came from his relationship with the Father. A couple other examples here. Number one there, Jesus' first miracle was also an act of submission, and it was actually an act of submission to his earthly mother. If you remember, John 2, they're at a wedding, the wine runs out, and Mary says to Jesus, hey, Jesus, they're all out of wine. Maybe with a wink, who knows? And Jesus' answer is, woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour hasn't come yet. He's like, Mom, it's not time yet. I'm not supposed to do anything about this. And then Mary turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. And in this, it's interesting. There's some interesting layers to this to meditate on. Jesus only did what the Father told him to do. And here Mary told him, Mary implied you should do something about this. And Jesus said, no. And my thinking is that he's like, no, the Father hasn't revealed that to me to do it. And yet he winds up doing it. And so what that tells me is, because it's equally true, he only did what the Father told him to do. But here he seems to be doing what his mother told him to do. It seems to me like the Father revealed this to Mary, or maybe made an allowance for Mary and her boldness in asking, her faith, and Jesus was then given the green light to do this. Like, he did this in that first miracle. There's an act of Jesus submitting to a fully human being, which is pretty wild to think about. So we see that his submission to the Father, his submission to his mother, and we could also see in the cross the greatest demonstration of his authority in defeating sin and the grave. It all happened through submission. If you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked the Father, if there's any way we can do it, any other way we can do this, let's go a different route. But not as I will, but as you will. And again, Father, if I cannot pass unless I drink it, then your will be done. And so even in going to the cross, again, the pinnacle of the demonstration of his authority, where he's going to complete victory over sin in the grave, that was done through an act of submission. And then even we'll say this third. So this came before the cross, but he's speaking about later. He's talking about judgment. And even in judgment, he pointed to a clear partnership between him and his Father. He said in John 5:22, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son and has given him authority to execute judgment. Okay? So Jesus said, the Father has given all judgment to me. He's entrusted it to me. This is, I think Hebrews gets at this when it talks about Jesus as the mediator between God and man. He's the only one who can rightly judge because he knows what it's like to live as one of us. He's the only mediator between God and man. But later in John 8, Jesus said this, you guys judge according to the flesh, but I judge no one. Even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it's not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. He's saying, even though the Father has entrusted all judgment to me, I judge along with the Father. I don't just go off and do it on my own accord. I and the Father who sent me judge together. So even when authority is given to him in this matter of judgment, he still does it in concert with his Father. Like submission, he will not be drawn out of submission to his Father. Like if I was in that spot, my response might be, thanks God, I'll take it from here. But Jesus remains in submission to the Father, even when the Father clearly delegates something to him. And this is kind of the pattern I want us to see. Now, to go kind of a contrasting way here, when we look at Jesus' temptation in the wilderness with Satan in Matthew 4, one of the temptations that Satan threw at him was, if you fall down and worship me, I'll give you all these kingdoms, showing him the kingdoms of the world. I'll give you all these kingdoms if you just bow down and worship me. And the idea behind it is, he's like, if you'll just submit to me, I'll give you these things without the cross. I'll let you skip that really hard part and get it kind of easy this way. And Jesus refused and rejected that offer. And the crux of the matter in all that is, who is Jesus submitted to? He refused to submit to Satan because it would have been forfeiting his destiny as the Son of God to make atonement for the sins of the world. He would have been saying no to that for the sake of an easier route and submitting to a different master, which Jesus knew is a horrible move because that master is not at all good and benevolent like the Father. So, but even in that temptation, we see this thing of the crux of where Jesus gets the authority over the kingdoms of the earth comes down to who is he submitted to. And he could have got it for free, basically, but selling his soul, in to put it that way. But he remained submitted to the Father, and it cost him everything. but he is now given the name above every other name, including Satan's. And at his name, every knee will bow and every tongue confess. And that comes from him being submitted to the Father. So even Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity, fully God, fully man, even his demonstration, his his example to us is that authority is received and exercised by remaining in submission to the one who has authority over you. And the third example I'll point to is Jesus and the centurion. Okay, it's a really well-known passage in this conversation, Matthew 8, verses 8 to 10. There's a centurion who's got someone who's sick, and he's asking Jesus to heal this person. And the centurion, Jesus says, "Sure, I'll come." And the centurion replies, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes." And when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to the other ones following him, "I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel." And but note the connection this centurion made. He said, "Jesus, I get how this works because I, like you, am a man under authority." He didn't say, "I'm a man of authority. I have authority. I possess authority." He's saying, what he's acknowledging is my authority over my servants and soldiers is derived from the one above me. I'm under him. He delegated or gave me authority, and that's the authority I operate in. And he said, I know it's the same with you. You're under authority so that when you say go, someone goes. When you say be healed, someone's healed. And again, it's the same principle. Even a Roman centurion got it, that authority is not taken, it's not stolen, it's not grasped, it's delegated, it's given. That's the best kind of authority to walk in. If we have to seize authority, the problem becomes you can't actually walk in that authority because now you're spending all your time and energy protecting it. If you look at the history of Judah and northern Israel, so the kingdom of Israel that split around 930 BC, 10 tribes to the north in Israel, Judah, Benjamin, most of the Levites to the south in Judah. If you look at their histories, they both had approximately 20 kings. Judah had 20, Israel had 19. But in Judah, those 20 kings were spaced out over 350 years approximately. And in northern Israel, those 19 kings were spread out over only 210. So you've got almost double the life expectancy of a kingship, of a reign in Judah compared to northern Israel. Why was that? In northern Israel, there were multiple assassinations over the years, multiple assassinations. And most of the time when there was an assassination, another one followed fairly quickly. In one case, Zimri, he assassinates his predecessor. I forget his name now. He reigns 1 week. He gets 7 days on the throne and he's gone. He's done away with. And another example later, a king assassinates predecessor and he's gone a month later. Like this just happened over and over and over again. If you take authority by force, you are now the one that has to defend that authority. But whereas in Judah, where that authority was passed down generation to generation, protected by the Davidic covenant, God's promise that one of the line of David will always sit on the throne, where that protection was in place, they didn't have to fight and defend it. There was one or two assassinations, but it was never someone seizing power and the power moving to another lineage. In the one case, it was the king was really, really bad, really, really bad for the nation. And a couple servants took it on themselves to end that king's life and let power transfer to their son, which isn't a great move. Anyways, but I hope you can see the difference. Northern Israel, there was this, it was like King of the Mountain. It was this continual fight for control and for power. And when someone got to the top of the mountain, now they're worried about defending that top of the mountain. And that's kind of the way it is. True authority isn't taken. It's not seized. It's given. It's delegated. And when that's the case, if I receive authority from one above me, the one above me is the one defending my sphere. I don't have to defend it myself. And that's kind of the idea here. It's actually a healthier way to walk in authority is when you're submitted to the one who delegates authority. It's a healthier way. It makes everything more prosperous for you. It makes your job easier. You've got covering. You've got protection. You're not fighting to keep what you stole. And so this is the pattern that's laid out for us. We even see it. I won't dive into it, but 1 Corinthians 14, as Paul's talking about spiritual gifts, talking specifically about prophecy, he's saying, look, I know you all want to prophesy. You all want to say what's on your mind or what you think you're receiving from the Lord, but it's got to be done in order and in subjection to the authorities over you. Like he's saying, 2 or 3 of you can prophesy, but let's not have everyone lining up and saying what they think God's saying, because there has to be order, there has to be a response. This has to be done well. And he says, at one point, if you reject, I've lost the passage there, but anyways, he says, if you think I'm off base in this, you shouldn't be acknowledged in the church. This is the way the church is to operate. We operate under authority, submitting one to another out of reverence for Christ, he says in another place. And this is how we're supposed to operate, in submission to those over us, not all having to get our bit out. We got to do things in order, and that order comes from being submitted to the one above you. It's not because that person's better than you. It's because that's how we're supposed to relate to each other. And the cool thing about all this is, if you go to 1 Peter 5, in 1 Peter 5, Peter addresses the elders, the shepherds, the overseers, and the younger ones in the church. And he says this. He tells the older ones first, you got to fulfill your role in the fear of the Lord. Okay. Not lording it over people, kind of as Jesus would have said, but doing this in the fear of the Lord. You're serving them. You're not ruling over them. And the younger ones, he says, remain submitted to the older ones. And then he says this in verse 5, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. That's the point. The way the church is supposed to be set up, the way this is all lined up is, we're all supposed to clothe ourselves with humility towards one another. If you're in a position of overseeing and influence and authority, you're not supposed to lord it over the ones that you're over. You're supposed to serve them. If anyone wants to be first among you, he must be last. If you want to be the greatest, you must be the lowest. Right? That's what Jesus said. And that's how it's supposed to play out here. So if you are not in a position of authority, you're not in a position of leadership in the church, your job is still to remain submitted to the ones over you, even if you think you could do it better than them, even if you think they suck. Now, this isn't touching on things of abuse and things like that. That needs to be dealt with. But in everyday life, one-to-one, if you're not in a role of leadership, you're supposed to remain submitted to the ones in leadership. And leaders, for us, I would say this is even more of a trap. We need to be absolutely certain that we're walking and living in the posture of a servant towards the ones we lead, not looking for what we get out of them, but how we can serve them. The Ephesians 5 gifts are for the equipping of the saints. It's not for us to stay on platforms. We're actually supposed to be equipping them to do the work of the ministry, getting under them, lifting them up, equipping them so they can walk in what God created them to do. We're supposed to all be clothed in humility towards one another, whether we're in leadership or not. We're all supposed to serve one another. That's the point. It's this general posture, this general lifestyle of having a humble, submitted heart. And that may sound really wrong today, because our culture, going back 50 years, we're all about questioning and challenging authority. That's what the culture tells us to do. Be suspicious of authority, question, push back, resist, retaliate against. But the Bible tells us, actually, the expectation is that we remain submitted to and humble before one another. Okay? So, just in closing, as we looked at before, we're to acknowledge the government's authority as God-given. Okay? Romans 13, Titus 3, 1 Peter 2, we're to recognize that they operate in authority that is God-given. Okay? God rubber stamps or green lights governmental authority on the earth. Doesn't mean he approves of everything they do, but he has given them authority. And we're to relate to those governments in a general posture of obedience, respect, and honor. Paul and Peter make that abundantly clear in those three passages. And as we remain in a posture of humility before those governing officials and show them honor, doors open for the church to have influence and for the gospel to enter in. We see that in Acts 16, and we see it in Acts 26, just in how Paul speaks to and deals with magistrates and governors and other leaders. And in Philippians 4:22, a very interesting comment, as he's signing off on his letter, he says, "Say hello to the house of Caesar for me." And right in that little statement is this glimpse into the gospel has made its way into even the household of Caesar. Whatever specifically he's mentioning, if that's the family of Caesar, if that's servants in his household, or something broader, we don't know. But the fact is the gospel was creeping closer and closer to Caesar through an instrument, Paul, who was committed to remaining subject to these governing authorities, even though his preaching of the gospel got him in trouble with them, and even though one of them, Nero, was going to have his head, he still remained in a posture of submission there, and through that, doors of influence opened to him. Okay, the pathway, and here's the kind of the concluding statement here: the pathway to greater influence or welfare. If you remember Jeremiah 29:7, seek the peace or the welfare of the city where you are, because in its peace you will have peace. The pathway to greater influence and bringing greater welfare, greater peace, greater blessing to the cities and country where we live is to remain submitted to the God-given authorities in our lives. Sorry if that's not what you wanted to hear, but that is what the scripture tells us, is we as we remain submitted to not only to leaders in the church, but even to governmental authorities. I think there's something about the way we walk in submission to them builds trust, builds credibility in us for God to entrust us with more. To him who little, if you're faithful in little, that's what I'm trying to go. If you're faithful in little, you will be entrusted with more. And as we learn to walk in submission to authorities, I think we build credibility and trust with God that he can entrust us with authority of our own, because we're learning this principle of remaining in submission to the one above us. So again, I want you to keep this one and hold it in tension with rebellion and resistance. And this is the challenge for us as the church, is to really wrestle with how we're supposed to carry these things. But I want to tell you, this is the pattern. This is the rule in Scripture. This is more often than not, far more often than not, when it comes to dealing with authority and authority figures, we're to remain in submission to them. And God can entrust with authority those who've demonstrated an ability to remain in submission. Okay? So that's what I got for you today. Thanks for joining. I pray that you're able to have grace to walk in submission and to have discernment and wisdom to know how we do that and when are the points that we actually do have to draw a line in the sand. But God bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brad. Well, we had to reshoot this video because we had some technical problems, and so what it's done is brought us to. I'm actually shooting this the day after the American election, so this is kind of interesting because we have a point of view. We can think that was a pretty robust election season. I can't believe how long their seasons are. They're over a year, maybe 2 years in the making. It's long. And so you're either ecstatic or you're not. You're either thrilled that Trump got in, or you're disappointed that, or you're either thrilled or disappointed. So it's really interesting. So it would have been interesting to see how we would be reacting had Kamala Harris gotten in, and just see what kind of attitude we'd have today. I'm pretty happy, to tell you the truth. I am. Trump is very pro-Israel. And that's really important to me. And we also saw a lot of things that were, anyway, I won't get into it, but But what kind of response would we have had if it were the other way around? And that's what I want to talk to you about, the importance of response. Because too often, yes, our leaders are important. Yes, it's very, very important. I shared before in regards to Prime Minister Trudeau when he first came in. My Facebook was not very honoring. My Facebook account was my son Isaiah would say, "Dad, you're really chirpy." That was the language. You're chirpy. That means, and the chirpy wasn't a nice chirp. It was, I was not saying good things. And I was showing my disdain. And then Holy Spirit started to really convict me on that, because we're supposed to be carrying our leaders in a significant way, in a much better way. And we see this in the Bible. You really don't see the Apostle Paul whining and complaining about their leaders, about the Caesars. You don't. In fact, he gets beat up, he gets put in prison. The angels keep rescuing him, which is phenomenal. But his main posture was, okay, my rights have been violated. I want to appeal to Caesar. So he knew that there were tools in his toolbox that he could use, and he was going to use them. We have tools in our toolbox, in our form of government, that we can use. Elections are one of those tools. And, there was a big debate on whether Christians should vote or not. Well, when I look at the Apostle Paul using his tools in his toolbox to be able to appeal for what was right for him as a citizen, we can use the tools for us. And in our society, that's elections. That's our democracy. And so we can use these tools. And when they don't turn out the way we want, well, then we can go a different way. I like to look at elections, and they'll tell you what the temperature of the city, of the nation is, right? And so right now, we see in the U.S. there's a temperature, and there's a temperature that wants to move towards more freedom. That is not going to stand up for, the crushing of freedom of speech. That's why you had Elon Musk in there, and actually buying Twitter, and leaving one of the few places that actually had free speech. And there are other things, and I won't get into the politics of the American election, but it's really interesting. It was very entertaining, and now what are we going to watch, right? And so we get back to Canada, and same thing. But the posture is how are we carrying this? How are we carrying with our leaders? Are we using the right tools? Some of our tools are writing letters when we see something that's not righteous. We're seeing sort of things. Just this morning, I was listening to something from a couple of our MP friends, and they were talking about digital ID and how this is getting snuck in and behind without any parliamentary oversight. So this is a concern, and I'll talk about how we can get around that. We can deal with this and work with this, and from a place of honor, but we still using the tools that we need. And so God gives us tools, and we can use tools. And so with that, I want to talk about us. What's the biblical ramifications? So Paul, the Apostle Paul, you don't see him ever slagging or revolting against any of the leaders of the day, right? Goes into jail. He comes out for preaching the gospel, comes out, and we're going to talk next week on when you're allowed to do this. So I'm going to talk about, we're going to get to when we're allowed to resist and when we're allowed to rebel. And but today we're going to talk about submission in authority of our leaders in government. Brad was just speaking on local church stuff, and so that's very really reflective. So this is what I find really interesting. I find those that are not necessarily submitted to anybody, they don't tend to be submitted to anybody. And I'm submitted. I have people in my life that I submit to. I've got about 6 or 7 men around me that I submit to. just as we walk together, I have a board of directors where I'm submitted. I have a local church to whom I'm submitted to. I go to that local church. I submit myself to the leaders of that place because I believe, even though I'm in a ministry, I need to be connected to the local church. And so I'm connected and I submit myself to leaders and I let them speak into me when and encourage me and also give direction. Same with Brad. Brad and I, we've been walking together for um, since 1997. He was just 14, I was 37, and we've been walking together. Um, now our relationship was a bit of a father-son relationship. And now sometimes it's a brother to the brother, and sometimes there are times that he speaks into me as a father, right? Because and that's where the submission comes from. But back to government. I like to look at Daniel, and if we look at Daniel and the life of Daniel, we look at how he postured himself. First off, in Daniel chapter 2, we see him come on the scene, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he's so frustrated with the dream, and nobody can interpret it. So he throws out this thing that if nobody interprets it, all the interpreters are going to die. So that's basically, so either do this, it's do or die for Nebuchadnezzar, right? But it's not Nebuchadnezzar; he's just dishing out the death. And so the Lord gives Daniel a dream, and I want to read this out of Daniel 2. This is actually, it's such a great passage on our posture, on how we carry government. This particular passage, just read this. It's so good because it gives us an infrastructure on how to carry government. So listen to this. Praise be the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. And how often have we prayed for wisdom with leaders? We have. That's the main thing we pray for. Wisdom, revelation. Wisdom that they know. And listen to this. Wisdom and power are his. He changes the times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells within him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked for. You have made known to us the dream of the king. And so he's able to go in and interpret the king. And as a result of this, he comes in, the first thing he asks, he says, okay, I have the goods. I have the interpretation. Tell the king, don't kill everybody. I just love that merciful heart. Don't king. He could have saved it. He could have been the king of the castle. He could have wiped out everything. He could have been the main line to communication to the king. If it was for ratings, he would get all the ratings if it was media. And Daniel says, no, spare them. Make sure they're there. Make sure, don't kill them. And then the king does this. It says, then the king, later in chapter 2, verse 48, the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of the wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained in the royal court. So here Daniel has this place of honor. He has this place of authority. He is submitted. He is submitted to the king. He comes in, and there's this posture that he's came. And not only that, but he's willing to share. And he goes, hey, I got some kingdom guys here. Shadrach, Meshach, bring them on. They're wise. And he has influence with the king. So often I say this often because when I was working on the political side of things, and I was the manager of the constituency office where we were, where we lived in Durham, I would oftentimes, you know, our member was a believer, and I would also oftentimes reach out to pastors and say, hey, do you want a meeting with the member? And they would always be kind of like, why would I want that? And I would say, so you can tell the member of parliament, or MPP in this case, or MLA, depending on part of the country you're in, that what the Lord is doing in your congregation. Share some of the great things that you're doing. Share some of the things. And there were some churches that were just wonderful. There was one church that in our, just down the street from where we are, they were fantastic on human trafficking. They were such a support and such a light. And they had many women and men that were trafficked in their congregation. What a great testimony, you know. So she would be able to share those stories with the premier on those things, you know, of the relevance of church. Remember back in COVID days when they thought church wasn't relevant, or wasn't really wasn't really, what's the word we used, essential. It's non-essential, and actually the church was very essential, and we learned that in a big way. But the governments don't know that, right? They know Christmas is for Easter and Christmas. Rather, churches are for Easter and Christmas, and weddings and funerals, and, you know, maybe a service, but they have no idea what actually goes on with the life of a church. That's why it's important that you share with your MPs. Once a year should be meeting with your member of parliament and sharing prayer groups. Go in there and meet with your member of parliament, your MLA, your mayor. Just tell them you're praying, and to build relationships. You hear me say this all the time. It's really important. So you see, so Daniel, he goes into this one place. He's with one king. He builds a relationship, and he has favor, you know. And then you see him again. You see this thing happened with him in Daniel 6. You know, something happens, right? Something happens. Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and this is with a different king. And Daniel's reputation goes with him from his reputation of honor, his reputation of being wise, his reputation of carrying wisdom and power from on high. It comes with him from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius. And a conspiracy happens and tries to take out Daniel, right? We get a lot of conspiracies. We're fearful of conspiracies. We see them all the time. We see the schemes of the enemy coming in to take out. We see this all the time. You know, even last night, I was listening to commentary on the election, the American election, and they said, had Kamala come in and won the election, this is a commentary. It's not my comment. It's just a commentary. It was from Daily Wire. And they said, had Kamala been president, that she would have gone off after the pro-life movement in a very hard way and putting them in jail. They said that could be there. I don't know if that's hyperbole or not, but that could be there. There's these conspiracies, right? And we see this all the time, that the enemy doesn't like when we're standing for righteousness, and they come against us. So this conspiracy comes, and Daniel gets thrown into a lion's den. We know the story, but let's look at Daniel's response to this. And this is what's so important, because too often when we find ourselves where we're being pushed, there's pushback, where we're being unfairly treated and unjust, it happens, you know, and we get really upset about this. And where did I put this here? Daniel, there it is, Daniel 6:21. You know, when we see this and we get all upset and we go, oh, my rights are being violated. Yes, they are. And, you know, I look at the underground church in China, and we look at Afghanistan and Iran and all these places where there's all kinds of unjustness, right? And they're doing all they can, and yet they're flourishing and they're growing and they're preaching the gospel, but it could cost them their lives. right? And here, when we get pushback and we get things, I get it. You know, we went through COVID, we went all kinds of things. Closed, churches were closed, pastors were arrested. There were a lot of stuff, things. You know, what is it? The what is it that? You're probably going to have to add this, David, right here. Drag queen story time, and pastors go in and people speak up and say, you know what, that's sexual behavior that you're putting in front of children. That's not healthy at all. How could that possibly be healthy? And pastors are thrown in jail for that. And so Daniel has done nothing wrong, right? Has lived the good. He's been honoring. He's done this. He's done king number 2, and he's done this. And look at his posture. I just love this. 6:21. And Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and has shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." Look at that. You know, Daniel could have been thrown in and he could have spouted off. And, you know, I don't know, if I was thrown in a lion's den, I just might call you a Nazi or something, right? But his posture was, "O king, live forever." And not only that, but he says, "And I have only honored you. I have never done anything wrong before you, O king." Can we say those things when we're talking about our members of parliament, when they do goofy things and when they stand for goofy things? Yes, we need to use our tools. Like I said in the beginning, we use our tools to speak into them and say, "I don't like this. This is not righteous. How can that be righteous?" And so there are tools that we use. Letter writing is a really good tool, not an email. In emails, it's easy for them, for the staffer to swipe left. You know, you might just slide you into a file, and they might tabulate you and say, "Okay, we had 20 of these emails today and that." But when you write a handwritten letter, in most cases, most offices are supposed to do this. When you have a handwritten letter, send it to Parliament. You can do that for free. Goes to the legislative office in Parliament, the parliamentary office, not legislative, the parliamentary office, and the same for, you know, an MLA or an MPP. You know, send a letter, tell them what you're concerned about, but always tell them that you're praying. Always tell them with honor. Always show honor. Doesn't matter. I mean, even just yesterday we were flying out here, and there was a minister. We're in Edmonton right now, and we got on a plane with a minister, and I won't tell you who, but he's in Edmonton, and he was right in front of us, and so I greeted him and said hello. It's cordial. Do I agree with his policies? No. And in fact, I had a run-in with him one time before, and he was kind of rude. To tell you the truth, he was kind of rude to me, but it's okay. I still greeted him and said hello. It's so good to see you, minister. And we got on the plane, and we got here, and getting off the plane, my bag got moved a little bit to behind, actually just to where he was seated, and you know, he grabbed the bag for me, and I said, "Oh, thank you, minister." I mean, just a little thing. Doesn't seem like a big idea. He was blown away that I recognized him. I think that's what Marilyn said, that I recognized him. But this is posture of honor that we always carry. You know, when we look at the Apostle Paul, like we started talking about Apostle Paul, one of my favorite verses, and you've probably heard me say this before, but those of you who haven't heard me, you'll love this. And it comes out of Philippians 4:20. It's a very obscure little verse. And it says, you know, meanwhile, you know, Paul has been thrown in jail many, many times. He's on his way to Rome. He's going to appeal to Caesar. There's a lot of injustice. I mean, the church is not embraced. I mean, it's growing, but it's hard. And there are people being thrown to the lions, and there were some really, really horrible things that happened in the first century church. But Paul says this, and I'm going to paraphrase out of Philippians 4:20. He says, oh yeah, he's wrapping up the letter, and he says, and by the way, say hello to the house of Caesar. So here, Paul had impact by preaching the gospel, impact and influence on the house of Caesar, so that he says, say hello, that there are people getting saved. They're believers in that house. Now, some say that they're probably servants, or some say they're family members. Doesn't matter. It's still in the house. He's embedded. The gospel is becoming embedded in the house of Caesar. And to the point where Tiberius says at one time, he says he was amazed that Christians loved Romans more than Romans loved Romans. And that was the influence. Here you see in Daniel 2, he gets favor and never once dishonors. And so that's what I want to say to you, that this is so important. Like, we have an election coming up in Canada. Could be any day, could be in October. Who knows? There's all kinds of things. We could be waiting on certain things. It could fall at any time because you've got unrest within the Liberal Party. These are some of my thoughts. You've got unrest. You've got 40 there that are not quite happy. They could break away and vote against the government to make their point because they want a new leader, right? You've got the Bloc looking for an excuse because they've already said that they were looking for a way if the government wasn't going to walk with them and give them what they wanted, they were going to vote against the government in a motion. And even now, right now, this past week, Chrystia Freeland, well, actually Marcy Ian, the woman, the Minister of Women's Affairs and Children, she brought forth a Ways and Means motion that potentially closes any nonprofits. They lose the nonprofit status of any organization that doesn't believe that isn't pro-abortion. I'm not even going to talk about pro-life because they've moved away from being pro-life. They're now pro-abortion. They want you to sacrifice at that idol of being pro-abortion. And so they brought this up. And so what it means, a Ways and Means motion is connected to the budget. That means there's no debate required. And it's a confidence motion. So it would be very interesting to see what happens in this confident motion. And they're doing it primarily as a wedge issue to say to society, see, look at those conservatives. They're pro-life. They don't want a woman's right to choose. They want all that. So that's what they're doing. They're creating this thing. And instead of pro-choice, but pro-choice is now becoming pro-abortion. And it's just a wedge issue. It's just a game. It's just part of the political game. But, something could happen in that. I don't know what could happen in there. But because it's a non-confidence motion or a confidence motion, the government could fall. And so we're watching, we're praying. But we're always watching and praying. That's the whole point. Not waiting for an election. I had even yesterday, a couple of American ministries reached out to me. I hope you guys are praying. It's like, yeah, dude, we've been praying for years, right? That's our posture. We're praying all the time. Even now, I said this. I had another ministry. We need a prayer strategy for the Canadian election. We have a prayer strategy. It's pray every day. Pray all the time. It's like this. I also get this all the time. I hear this. There's people ask, when is Canada? Canada doesn't have this. And Canada needs this thing, and it's called the National Day of Prayer. Canada needs a National Day of Prayer. Well, I want to say this. Every day is the National Day of Prayer in Canada. Every day. Because if we're just going to leave it to one time a year, that's just crazy. Because if you don't think it's crazy enough in our society, and you're not praying, like, what are you doing? It's important that we engage, and we engage in time, and we engage with a heart of honor. We honor one another. We see this in James. I can get into this. Brad touched it, but even James 4, it's talking about how we honor and walk with each other, and that even some of our prayers don't get answered because we're quarreling all the time. That's just phenomenal. And so we carry a culture of honor. We submit to each other. We submit to one another. We submit to our leadership in local church. We submit to our leadership in our prayer teams. We just walking and yielding to one another. James 3 has this component of yielding to authority. God loves this when we do this, that we love and honor. It's not about, we're not saying submit to abuse. We're not saying that. Brad touched that either. But in healthy relationships, there's this give and take and listening and yielding. And that's what's really healthy. And so the same thing with government. So we have tools in the toolbox, and we're going to use the tools when we need them, but we're going to do it from a place of honor. We're going to do it from a place of respect. We're going to do it from a place not carrying offense, right? Same thing, a lot of times people get hurt at church because they're offended, or they're offended with one another. Recently we just came through the days of awe, the Hebrew season of feasts. Started off with the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, and ends with the day of Yom Kippur. So there's these 10 days of this, actually a little further, because then it goes to the Feast of Tabernacles. But between the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of Yom Kippur, there's these 10 days, and they're called 10 days of awe. And they're wonderful. And there's basically a runway to Yom Kippur for the Jewish people, where they would take the 10 days and be reflective, and to make all the relationships good. And that's what was their postures, making the relationships good. And this sounds like a good thing. But here in Christianity, the Apostle Paul says, don't carry offenses. So it's not a matter of waiting for a season of the year, right? Which is a wonderful season. I love the feasts. But it's important that we deal with stuff right away. That we don't carry it for a year or 2 years or forever. I don't know how many people that I meet in the prayer movement that are not connected to local churches, that are not connected to anybody because of offense. So we need to be dealing with offense right away, so that we can get this working and this working, the relationship this way and this way. So anyway, I just want to encourage you. When we're submitted to government, we have tools. Use the tools, but do it from a place of honor. Do it from a place of respect. And next week, we're going to talk about when it's lawful to rebel and to resist. Anyway, I'm Chris Byberg, the director of the National House of Prayer. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.